Well, I'm known as Bessie. Anyway, Bessie Webb. Glenreagh is known as a timber village rather than... Gold was discovered first in 1880, 1881, but it's gold cut out at the turn of the century, and it's more known as a timber village. Timber took over then. The railways and roads were spreading out all over New South Wales at the turn of the century, and there was a big demand for timber, and timber was plentiful around here. So some of the prospectors that took up land in around the 1905 mark got into timber, and there was bullock teams and for sleepers, and the railway, they were agitating for a railway to open up the country. Well, how it got out in the first place, the coastal steamers were coming up to Grafton. They also were coming into Coffs, but Coffs was known as a very bad port in those days. People had to be loaded off in baskets off the steamers in onto the ferries, and one of my relations remembers being loaded off in the basket. But it mainly came into South Grafton. The wharves were at South Grafton, and the bullock teams took the logs into there, and the sleepers and things. But later on, the railway to Glenreagh started from South Grafton in 1913, and it got out as far as Kungala. There was great agitation there because there was traffic jams with bullock teams in the loading yard to load they offloaded the timber trucks to take it then by trucks. And they were pleading for the railway people to send more trucks to save them going that extra time into Glenreagh, because I think it used to take a week for the bullock wagons to get from Glenreagh to Grafton and back. My father was a bullock driver and a timber cutter as well, and us as kids had timber cutters living all around us, timber workers, strong, capable men. I used to think they cared a lot about us kids, but I think because Mum cooked their corned meat and we hand milked about 5 or 6 cows, and Mum made homemade butter. You've got to think that we were 11 mile up Tallawudjah Creek away from the store, so the men were appreciative of milk and homemade butter. And my earliest memories is going to their tents and camps with food for them from Mum, and then them minding us while Mum and Dad went to Grafton. If you went to Grafton in the sulky in those days, you stayed overnight. The railway came to Glenreagh in 1915, and that's when they started loading. They put a gantry in over there to load the timber, and they loaded the timber, then went from Glenreagh. And they used to get their sleepers and put them in the yards, as they called them over there, and the inspector would pass them, and then they'd be loaded on to the trucks and things, the timber trucks, and they'd go from there. And then when the train went on to Dorrigo, the Dorrigo line was opened in 1924, the timber trucks came down from the Dorrigo, loaded with timber from up there, and very few, just one passenger carriage and a lot of timber came down. When the timber workers went up in there, they didn't own the land, or my father owned the land, and I know my uncles owned the land, but they'd let cutters on, and you cut for so much, you had to pay royalty on the timber that you cut. You cut them and you barked them, you took the bark off. To cut the sleepers, they had a broad axe. As a kid, Dad would say to us, "Who's going to blue tongue for us today?" And blue tongue was that you came behind the wagon and put the brake on when the bullocks were going downhill. So there was always somebody to release the brake when they got down, or put it on a bit more if the wagon was gaining on the bullocks going down a steep hill or something like that. The 2 back bullocks were called polers, because they had the pole in between them fastened to their neck, and they were called the polers. And the leaders, you had special bullocks for special jobs they were trained for, because I remember if you lost a leader, you looked around for another leader bullock from somebody else that had a leader. And it was marvellous how those bullocks knew their position in the team. I can remember my dad yoking them up, and we'd help him put the pin in as kids on the yoke that kept the heavy yoke round the bullock's neck and connected them. We'd be there helping him and whatever, and they'd just go and stand. We weren't frightened of them or anything. Our property was a long lane up to it, and where right near the house was slip rails across the lane, and we kids used to go out and let the slip rails down for the different bullocky as they were passing through with their loads or things. Bullocky was the term we called the driver of the. He was a bullocky, yeah. And when Dad came home that night, he'd say, "Who was on the who did you let the slip rails down for today?" Sometimes we'd say the leader's name, like whatever we knew every leader's name, like Dodger and Smart and Dodger was one, and we didn't say Smart too well sometimes. He used to laugh, I remember. You know, we let Smart and Dodger through rather than the owner's name, but we all called the men by their first name. But I don't remember that we were disrespectful to them. It was just the way the kids were, you know, in those days. My father didn't go to school a day in his life. He was born at the head of the Clarence River, up in the Malera goldfields, and there was no schools up there, but his mother could read and write, and she taught him. But all the old timber workers told me he had the greatest mind for working out the super feet in a timber tree growing. They'd get him to say how many sleepers. He could tell you how many sleepers they'd cut out a log just by looking at it or walking around it. And big girders went out of here. They were the girders under the bridge, under the wooden bridges, the big heavy ones. In trying to work out whether any of the logs floated down, they used I think they did, but they had to do it in the Orara. They had to wait till the Warise was in the river to float some logs down, but I couldn't see, because of the narrowness of it, I couldn't see where they'd put big loads of it across. You know, they'd only be small lots, I think. In 1936, my grandmother died, and we went over to work her farm. By then he'd got rid of his bullock team. We'd started dairying. He swapped his bullocks because he was getting too old to walk the distance on the road. He was in his mid-50s at that stage, and got some cows for us. He thought he had kids to milk cows. He could start dairying. I remember him building the dairy and swapping his bullocks to Mr. Green for some cows, and we started dairying and separating for cream. In those days the factory was at Cranber, and we brought the cream down in the sulky to meet the cream lorry, because he wouldn't go all the way up there on the rough roads, and we'd have to bring it down and meet him halfway up Tallawudjah Creek near the school, and he'd take the cream and he'd bring you the ready-made butter. Then you'd buy the butter back, but we still had the separator, and we could separate, fed calves, fed pigs. But I am into history. I love the history of the village. Glenreagh, yeah.